We all have a responsibility to get ourselves better educated about where our goods, where our clothes, where our food, where our medicine, where everything that we use. Is it critical that our goods arrive as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible? Or is it more important that we show a little bit of care and concern for the people who are responsible for it?
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you will hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from Ian Ralby, who's a global expert in maritime law and security. In this episode, you're going to hear about seafarers impacted by armed conflict, those who are navigating high-risk areas like the Red Sea to keep goods moving. My colleague Francesca Fairbairn spoke to Ian and John Attenborough about this issue. John is from the charity Mission to Seafarers. Francesca, before we hear from Ian and John, can you give us a sense of just how important seafarers are to our daily lives?
Sure, thanks, Deborah. Well, it's a heavily used statistic, but 90% of world trade happens by sea. And most of us don't even think about it. So more or less everything that you can see around you as you're listening to this podcast, either the product itself and or some or all of the components in it have travelled by sea at some point. Plenty of people say no shipping, no shopping. And I believe John or Ian would say no seafarers, no shipping, no shopping. So adding the seafarers into that. There are 1.5 to 2 million seafarers who are responsible for crewing our container ships, our bulk cargo ships, and they are enormously important. Without them, nothing gets anywhere, basically, in our world economy. But as Ian Ralby will say, we're overwhelmingly sea blind. You know, what goes on in the high seas, we simply have no visibility of it at all. Ian Urbina, with whom we've also done a podcast, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who runs a project called the Outlaw Ocean Project. He calls the ocean the watery Wild West, and that's pretty much what it is.
Tell me, why did you want to speak to Ian and John specifically about this?
I wanted to speak to Ian about it to get a picture of the situation from a global geopolitical perspective. He's a globally recognised expert in maritime law, one focus being maritime security. Ian is founder and CEO of security consultancy IR Consilium. And he was also instrumental in drafting the International Code of Conduct, which is the organisation is known as ICOCA, and that deals with the ethical certification of private security companies, and that includes maritime security companies. John is on the ground meeting with seafarers every day. He's regional director for Middle East at Mission to Seafarers, which is a charity that works in over 200 ports globally and provides help to seafarers and their families. Also advocates for better treatment of seafarers, and their help extends to helping fund rent, funeral costs, helping with trauma, providing ministry in ports or just somewhere to go where they can talk about the experiences they've had or the fears that they have. Mission to Seafarers also works, by the way, with abandoned seafarers in the Middle East, providing food and water and helping them to get home.
Thanks, Francesca. Let's hear from John Attenborough now. His team has been speaking to seafarers who shared what life is like for them, given the current attacks in the Red Sea.
So my region, it covers the Middle East, but also South Asia as well. So we cover India and Sri Lanka. And what our teams are experiencing and witnessing firsthand is actually worry, stress, seafarers who are scared by going through the Red Sea, wondering if, they're going to be the ones targeted. And what is really interesting for us is that the seafarers on the ships that are going through these areas, they're actually telling us, with the Somali issue some years ago, they said you could see that on the radar. And yes, that was nervous and that was also not a pleasant time, but you could see the threat coming towards you on the radar. And yes, latterly towards the end of the Somali conflict, the international community were all over it, providing military support. So the seafarers used to say, have said to us that you never felt that far away from help. This, however, with the Houthis, has changed completely Because now seafarers are telling us we don't know where the danger is coming from. We don't know if our ship is going to be hit by a drone or a rocket or a sea mine or, an underwater drone. You don't know where the danger is coming from.
Yeah.
So we've got a team in Aqaba. Rahid, he's our port welfare officer in the port of Aqaba. So very much at the forefront. Now, he's seen a lot of ships that are stopped coming because of, the shipping companies taking a go around. But he's also visited the ships that have come into the port of Aqaba.
Aqaba being in what country, sorry?
Jordan.
Jordan, thank you. Yeah.
And so they come up through the Gulf of Aqaba, up through the Red Sea. And he's saying that when he's speaking to the seafarers, even though the seafarers are telling him, well, our ship has got nothing to do with Israel, it's got nothing to do with the UK, it's got nothing to do with America, but still the seafarers are actually very nervous on board. And he says, and actually, we just spend time listening, letting them just offload those worries and that stress.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there has been apparently a worrying uptick in Somali piracy as well, presumably kind of just piggybacking off the kind of general lawlessness in the area. And I think, Ian Ralby, who I'll talk to after this, he will probably cover the fact that the Houthis, they're getting publicity for bombing ships, right? So they don't care where the ships are coming from. It's interesting. I was reading the other day about the Iran-Iraq war from a book called The Corporeal Life of Seafaring by Laleh Khalili, when shipping was targeted specifically for whatever reason, and hundreds of seafarers were killed. And they weren't even mentioned. It was about ships being lost rather than seafarers being lost. So, I mean, if you can call this a kind of progression in terms of seafarers' rights, then it would be that the danger to them is being acknowledged. And I believe, from what I understand, and you can correct me on this, that shipping companies are aware they don't want to lose crew, they are taking care.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The shipping industry has come a long, long way, I think, since the Iran-Iraq war, and good crew are hard to find. And once the shipping company has invested, because that's what they ultimately do, a good shipping company invests in their seafarers, invests in their workforce, absolutely that. And so with regards to the shipping industry, the industry have improved. So as an industry, they are looking after their own crew. And we had one instance actually in Colombo in Sri Lanka, where some crew had just joined the vessel. They'd just come on board the vessel in Colombo. And the route had changed just literally as they got on board to say, oh, actually, the ship is no longer going down the east coast of Africa. We thought it was going down the east coast of Africa to the west coast of Africa. Actually, we're now going through the Red Sea. And the new joiners, which included the new captain said, no, that's not what we were told. We refused to sail. And it was a big shipping company who was involved. And they said, yes, fair enough. We understand there's a piece of legislation that actually we can sign you back off the ship. And that's what happened.
And I believe that the Joint War Committee, when they designate the Red Sea or whichever listed area, seafarers are legally able to do that without compromising their own insurance. I would just add, and I imagine you'd probably agree, that although ship owners and operators in the industry has come a long way, there are still many instances where seafarer welfare is pretty low down the list of priorities, whether it be from the charterers or the companies themselves. Now, these aren't necessarily always the big names that you and I know, but they might be from one or two ship operators, although still the big companies, there are some practices that should be addressed. But at least in this situation, rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, the big underwriters allowing that is definitely a kind of step forwards. So, John, perhaps you can tell me a little bit about the support that Mission to Seafarers offers and has offered to seafarers that are perhaps nervous about going up the Red Sea or whose ships have been attacked.
Indeed. So what we've been doing as a region and an organisation, we've been actually tracking ships especially those that have been hit and targeted. And what we are trying to do is locate next port of call. So then we can pass that on to our teams. And this has happened several times. One of our teams in Mumbai, he visited our chaplain in Mumbai, visited a ship that had been hit by a rocket. Mercifully, no loss of life, no injuries at all, but obviously shaken up crew. So he spent quite a lot of time. Another ship that went down to Tuticorin in the south of India. Again, the ship was hit. A couple of the crew members were injured, not seriously, mercifully. But again, the chaplain was on board with his team, spent a long time with them, brought some treats, and just sat and listened. And actually, every single crew member wanted to tell their story about where they were, what they were doing, how this happened, how this has affected them. And then another ship had gone into Richards Bay, again, that had been hit, big hole in the side of the ship. But again, our mission team in Richards Bay in South Africa, again, spent a lot of time, managed to get the crew off to the Seafarers Centre that we run in Richards Bay, just so they could have a bit of rest and relaxation, get away from the ship. And it's things like that we are there, a listening ear, somebody that really cares, reaches out to the crew. And I know the seafarers and their families really, really appreciate that.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, it's amazing what Mission Seafarers does, and we're very grateful for Mission Seafarers for partnering with us on many of our larger advocacy projects. But of course, you do this critical work on the ground as well. Thank you very much, John. So now I'd like to talk with Ian Ralby, who is a globally recognised expert in maritime law. Ian is an academic, founder and CEO of security consultancy IR Consilium. And you were also, I believe, instrumental in the drafting of the International Code of Conduct, which is for private security services. I should mention that the International Code of Conduct applies also to private maritime security services, which is obviously very relevant here as we talk about seafarers in times of conflict. So you're based in Baltimore, Ian, and as many of us will know, there has been a maritime disaster there recently. But today, as I said, I wanted to focus on the topic of safety and security of seafarers, specifically in the context of conflict. Now, the two most obvious current ones are Ukraine and the Houthis in the Red Sea. Well, the Red Sea isn't exactly a war zone, but it is a very high-risk area for cargo ships, I believe, at the moment. So perhaps you could just tell me to begin with what risks do seafarers generally tend to face in times of conflict, and you can talk about past and or present.
Absolutely. It's an interesting phenomenon. We tend to not think about how the 90% of world trade that happens by sea actually moves. And it is important to always remember that there are human beings who are actually responsible for that transport of our goods, and that even in times of conflict, the goods continue to flow. During the pandemic, for example, we were all stuck at home, and yet our goods were still moving, and that was down to the seafarers who were out at sea continuing to make maritime commerce flow. When a conflict comes out in any part of the world, there is likely going to be some impact on the maritime space. However, it's interesting that for many years, we did not hear much about the maritime implications of different wars, different conflicts. Then something changed in November of this past year, and now we're talking about it. Similarly, with Ukraine, we're not hearing every day now about the grain initiative and all the different issues that were a major focus of headlines in the early days of the conflict. And while insurance premiums will raise with war risk policies, it generally is not even discussed in major international circles as to whether vessels will continue to call or not. They just will. That's just how it has gone for a long time. And so, unfortunately, seafarers tend to be out of sight, out of mind, even more so than maritime commerce being out of sight and out of mind.
Yeah. And I think, the crew change crisis was a really good example of that, where seafarers were not considered to be frontline workers, so they were not allowed to disembark their ships, even though obviously flight attendants, pilots were allowed to come and go relatively freely. So seafarers were stuck on board vessels often beyond their contract by several months, if not a year or two, not knowing when they might ever be able to go home.
Well, there were a mix of factors, right? We don't think about the 400,000 seafarers that were stuck on land, unable to work as well. And so there were a lot of different aspects to the pandemic that I think have really actually become lessons that aren't just being identified, but learned by the shipping industry, the maritime industry. There had to be better, not only cooperation, but willingness to be agile in identifying issues and addressing them in a timely fashion. And that has not historically been the way that the shipping world worked. And so there is, I think, in some ways, a greater degree of agility today than there was 2 or 3 years ago. And that has helped us deal with the Red Sea conflict in a much more efficient and effective way that hasn't passed on what could have been exorbitant costs to every consumer around the world, because we saw an ability to recognize the strategic shock and adapt to it without it becoming catastrophic in somewhat the same way that the supply chain crisis had really affected not only the flow of goods, but the price of goods.
So in relation to seafarers, when you say recognize the strategic shock and react to it, what does that mean in practical terms? Does that mean rerouting ships around the Red Sea? Does that mean, I know that the Joint War Committee, which is Lloyd's of London underwriters, saying that, you know, there won't be a problem if they don't want to sail through the Red Sea.
Exactly. I think the Red Sea situation, more so than Ukraine, more so than any other conflict we've seen, we are seeing at this point a direct assault on maritime commerce. This is the first time that they weren't caught in the crossfire. They were the targets of a non-state armed group, heavily armed group, who have a very clear track record of being erratic and indifferent to human life, attacking people at sea. And no matter how they style themselves in terms of why they are trying to do this, it is very clear that they have no problem attacking and killing innocent lives to pursue their own objectives. And so the seafarers, again, from all over the world, have been caught in what has become a very unusual maritime situation. And so this is, the first time we've really had to consider closing this major of a maritime route for a non-state group acting out in this manner. I mean, piracy never closed off maritime commerce. It made it more difficult. It required all kinds of adaptive changes to security measures on board. It required naval presence. It required other things. But this is fundamentally different. And what we have seen is a much more open-eyed willingness on the part of shipping lines to say, I don't care what the extra costs are. We're not gonna take the risk of losing seafarers going through. And you'll see that the majority of the major shipping lines were very quick to say this is not worth the risk. And it was a very quick decision to take on a massive logistical challenge. If you look at who changed first, it was the container lines. And that is actually really important to note, because the cargo that is being taken on each ship is different, right? So you have different types of ships carrying different types of cargo. When you have tankers, they're carrying oil or chemicals. That is something that can be replaced, right? You know, if you're expecting a tanker full of gasoline, you don't really care where it's coming from. Similarly, if you're carrying a bulker full of grain, it can be replaced. Grain can come from somewhere else. But if you're a container carrier and you're carrying somebody's personal effects going to a specific location, or you're carrying a very specific order of things in a specific container going to a specific location, you can't just replace it. It's not a fungible commodity in the same way. And so the container lines have a very difficult logistical challenge, because the containers have to go where they're intending to go, and they have to figure out how to get them there. And rerouting brought with it all kinds of costs and challenges. And they've done an incredible job of not passing an exorbitant amount of those costs on to the consumers, because they recognize that there's a market balance that needs to be struck. And so the seafarer lives were very visibly the main concern. I was part of lots of discussions, and every time that a Navy would even push them to say, hey, don't you think it's safe enough to go through? They weren't even budging on the notion that we're not taking the risk to lose the life of a seafarer. It was never about the cargo. It was never about other things. It was we don't want to lose a seafarer. So are they uniform in that? No, absolutely not. Look at what we're seeing. We still see about a 45% of what we would normally expect to be going through ships still going through, and that indicates that there are a lot of different factors at play, and there are a lot of different motivations for why a vessel might go through. Some shipping lines couldn't absorb the change, they couldn't handle it, and so they decided it was worth the risk. Others are likely thinking that they are safe because they don't perceive any kind of direct threat to themselves because of any kind of affiliation that they have, and they believe that the Houthis actually are targeting specific vessels because of their personality. The fact is, though, that there are a lot of ships still taking a risk, and we need no further indication of that than there are still ongoing attacks. And just last month, we saw the first casualties at sea. We saw 3 seafarers killed on the True Confidence, a Barbados flag vessel that was actually heading for the Bab el-Mandeb, hailed on the radio by what claimed to be the Humanitarian Operations Coordination Center, which is actually the Houthis' operations cell that attacks ships, but they've done a very nice job of branding themselves. They claimed that the Yemen Navy was looking out for them and that they should turn around in order to not be attacked. They did turn around. They did follow the Houthis' instructions, not knowing that they were literally listening to the Houthis, positioning them to where the Houthis wanted to attack them. And so this is the kind of conflict and challenge that we're dealing with. Who do you trust? Who do you listen to? Who is giving the right guidance as to how to proceed? And unfortunately, in that particular instance, the seafarers paid the ultimate price for listening to the Houthis and taking them at their word. So this is an ongoing conflict and challenge that is going to keep evolving. And the Houthis have recognized that their assault on seafarers needs to continue to take different forms. They started out with obviously very visible, high-profile abduction of the Galaxy Leader on the 19th of November. They boarded the ship, they filmed it all, they put out social media about taking this ship by force and bringing it back into Yemen, where the 35 seafarers on board are still stuck as hostages and are part of what has now become a museum exhibit on the part of the Houthis. It's a national museum. So that information operations campaign will continue, and I unfortunately see them potentially trying to escalate further through attacks farther afield, potentially other types of attacks, even on land outside of their jurisdiction. And ultimately, they have infrastructure that they could start to try to target, like the submarine cables that they have threatened to cut over and over again, the impact of which would potentially be even greater than disrupting just maritime commerce alone, given that 97 to 99% of all communication, telephonic and internet, go through submarine cables every day. About $10 trillion worth of economic activity goes through those cables every day, and a third of the world's internet, a third of that infrastructure runs along the Yemen coast. And so if they were able to take that out, every human being on Earth would feel some degree of effect of that.
Wow. So, I mean, I wonder, from the shipping companies or the ship owners and operators' perspectives, what possibilities are open to them in terms of protecting the lives of their seafarers? And I guess it's what's open to them. I guess it's security. And I mentioned earlier on private maritime security on board vessels. I guess there's floating armories. I guess also the role of port and flag state authorities and navies and so on. I wonder what kind of combination of all of those things is proving effective.
Well, it depends on the context. Obviously, piracy, which is also resurging and creating a new concern for seafarers yet again, poses one set of challenges, right? You generally have armed but lightly armed individuals embarking on a vessel in order to attack another vessel. And so you actually have a human-to-human interaction. They can be stopped. Human beings can be stopped. And even though there is a great degree of danger, there are certain elements of hardening the vessel through different mechanisms and means, as well as you say, employing armed guards and using floating armories potentially on either side of a particular area where you're most likely to be targeted in order to embark and disembark both the weapons and those guards. That model for countering piracy has worked pretty well in the Indian Ocean for the last 12 years. And unfortunately, we have seen the greatest spike in activity in the Northwest Indian Ocean on piracy over the last several months since the 22nd of November. But we've also seen an incredibly powerful response by the Indian Navy in particular, pushing back against the pirates, and not just fighting them, but doing something that I think really will change the picture, which is they didn't just push back and try to stop the pirates in their activity. They took the 35 pirates that were recently involved in an incident on board the Maltese flag vessel, the Ruin, and they brought them back to India for prosecution. And what we have found over the years, whether it is in the Northwest Indian Ocean or in the Gulf of Guinea or in Southeast Asia or anywhere else, that you have to physically change the risk-reward calculus. You can't just have an operational security-based solution to combating piracy. You have to say, look, there are consequences that are very grave and that you may end up really not enjoying. And we're talking about a small group of individuals. We're not talking about thousands and thousands of people. The Houthis have recruited several 100,000 people. We're not talking about that. We're talking about dozens of people involved in piracy. And that means that A, they know each other, and B, they all have families that talk to each other. And when 35 of them disappear at once to spend the rest of their lives in an Indian prison, most likely, that changes people's mentality. So that is one sort of set of approaches. In the Red Sea context with the Houthis, though, we're not private armed security and providing barbed wire on the edge of the ship isn't going to make any difference against a missile. They're not going to make any difference against a drone. These types of attacks are a military style attack that require a military style response in order to defend. And they're not that easy to defend, even for the best militaries. So that is a very unique context set of motivations.
In some ways, I feel like this is not a rare example, but a less common example of where the companies themselves, and obviously, you know, where the Institute for Human Rights and Business, and so we're looking at that, really are stepping up to the plate more than in other circumstances. I mean, it would be interesting to know, for example, some of those ships that you mentioned, what they were carrying, who the owners were, because I imagine the smaller operators whose financial margin is less, they might be like, we're just going up there, you know, and that is reflective in the fact that a lot of ships are abandoned around that area by companies who just sort of wipe their hands of the hardware type things. So life is cheaper for those owners and operators, I'd have thought.
I think that's a really important point, in that the shipping industry is one of the most competitive in the world, because you're looking at different companies from all over the world competing with each other for the same cargo. So whether they're coming out of the United States or out of Singapore or out of Europe or Malaysia or Thailand or Africa or South America or wherever they're coming, they are all in the same competitive space. And so that has led to, as you say, very thin margins and a very, very competitive spirit. However, there has been an interesting set of evolutionary changes over the last probably 15 years or so. And I remember being in a meeting, maybe 2009 or 10, where the company security officer of one of the largest lines actually said, look, we can compete on absolutely everything except for security, because just as we are all competing in the same space, the security space is common to all of us. And when one of us is harmed, all of us are harmed. And so there has been a gradual recognition that there is a reason to come together, whether it's in the tanker space, the container space, the bulker space, whatever it is, to take a common position on the security challenges that are facing not only shipping, but the seafarers on board. And that has created a little bit of a tension, because on the one hand, you do have these margins, you do have that competitive spirit, you do have the economic survival of the company at stake. But at the other hand, you have the need to look out for not only the human rights, but the survival of the people on board. And that is a reality that a lot of ship owners have had to face. And we've seen a lot of different decisions taken. We've seen some be more risk averse and say, you know what, it's not worth it. And we've seen others have the appetite to take the risk in order to stay competitive. And ultimately, you know, it is down to the individual owner. But we've also seen a lot of pressure coming from both the shippers. So there's a difference between the shipping lines, they're the ones that carry the goods, and the shippers, they're the ones whose goods are being carried. And even governments, all of whom have different motivations. And so the shipping lines are the ones that have the direct relationship with the seafarers. And they tend to be the least interested in taking the risk of losing a seafarer, whether it's through piracy, through an attack, or through anything else. Whereas the shippers want their goods as cheaply as possible, as quickly as possible. And so there's always that tension between what the shipping lines need to do to look out for their people and what the shippers need to do to look out for their customers. And then governments kind of come in and often don't understand fully who's what, where, why. And that lack of maritime knowledge has been profoundly visible over the last few months in dealing with the Red Sea crisis. Navies don't tend to interact with shipping lines, so they don't know what their interests are. Government organizations don't know anything often about the maritime space and how it works, particularly outside of their own waters. And so you have these very bizarre sets of ideas, of misconceptions, assumptions, and it creates a very difficult picture to navigate, no pun intended. And that has caused a lot of the companies to be in a bit of a scramble, saying, what's more important, the guys who are on board or the people who need to be fed if that ship doesn't arrive with food on board? It's a horrible catch-22 in some ways when you're looking at knowing that the goods that you're carrying are potentially life-saving or life-altering, and yet the fact that they have to be carried through an area of high risk is potentially life-threatening or life-altering for those on board. And so that is a real challenge for those who are involved in this space.
I mean, when I said there are tight margins, I was talking more about the smaller operators, actually. But as to your point about flag state, port state, navies not really being aware of the kind of opaque and possibly, dare I say it, intentionally opaque and complex supply chain that kind of provides a lot of breathing space, shall we put it, between people who are having stuff transported and the people who are transporting them. But it is one of the most complex areas in world commerce, right? So, any ship, it might be flagged to one country, owned by another country's operator. It might be managed by a chartering company going from Singapore to Nairobi with Australian coal and Filipino crew. So, and all the while in international waters where there's no jurisdiction. So it is fantastically complicated to kind of unpick if you're looking to work out who is responsible for the welfare of those seafarers, whether it be during a time of conflict or indeed any other time. And, that is reflected in the fact that seafarers often have no idea where they can go if there is a grievance that they want to have remedied. And it's good to hear that the Indian authorities are on top of this. And indeed, John Attenborough, who I spoke to before, he said that the Indian authorities have been very good. And so too the Indian ports, mission to seafarers centres in Indian ports, where they allow the seafarers to kind of decompress, if you like.
Very much so. And I think to your point about jurisdictions, the role of the flag state is critically important in all this. So it doesn't matter who owns it. It doesn't matter the nationality of the cargo, the crew, other aspects of the vessel. The flag is the exclusive jurisdiction on the vessel outside of the territorial sea of the state. And so it's everywhere, but as a practical matter, once you leave a coastal state jurisdiction, you are floating on a piece of territory of the flag state. And what we've seen is that there is a not only commercialization, but just a sort of a delegation of flag state responsibilities to corporate entities, often outside of the actual jurisdiction. And the corporate entity that has been delegated to really doesn't care whether the individuals are sanctioned or not, doesn't care whether they're trafficking drugs or not, doesn't care whether they're abusing human rights or not. And so there's very little actual oversight. And in some cases, we've seen the actual country not even realize that their flag was being flown by vessels all over the place, and their name, their laws, their brand as a country were being affected by it because it was out of sight, out of mind. And so getting greater control over flag state jurisdictions is ultimately going to be, I think, an issue that we're going to have to face at some point, because there are too many issues that come up. The law on this is encapsulated in Article 91 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which requires that there be a genuine link, and those are the words that are used, a genuine link between the vessel and its flag. The problem is that genuine link has amounted to essentially just a contract, and that has been an interpretive elision that has allowed for us to have a really messy picture of jurisdictions, to the point that, as you said, at any given time, if you picked any of the 60,000 or so vessels that are engaged in maritime commerce, you could take a cargo vessel. You could probably find 50, 60, 70 different country affiliations with that vessel based on the flag, the owner, the beneficial owner, the financiers, the insurance, the cargo ownership, and the crew itself. And so the notion, for example, that the Houthis are or are not targeting certain countries is almost laughable, because take aim at any ship out at sea and there's a pretty good odd that you're going to hit something with a US, a UK, or an Israeli affiliation. Equally, saying that they aren't going to target China or Russia is equally laughable, and that take aim at any ship at sea, there's a pretty good chance that, particularly in the case of China, that you're going to find some kind of nexus. And so the nationalized personality of vessels at sea is a very tenuous link at best.
Absolutely fascinating. So what do you think those of us working in business and human rights can do, those working for or engaging with shipping companies, in order to help protect seafarers?
Well, I think this is a question all of us should be asking, everyone should ask, because one of the most pressing needs to address this space is to understand the space. We all have a responsibility to get ourselves better educated about where our goods, where our clothes, where our food, where our medicine, where everything that we use. Now, all of that comes with a degree of realigning how we want to put our attention and our focus. Is it critical that our goods arrive as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible from the other side of the planet? Or is it more important that we show a little bit of care and concern for the people who are responsible for it? Anyone that's lived in an island will know that if a storm comes through and a ship can't make it, you have no potatoes for the next week. You have no, whatever random good it is, shampoo. And so let's be a little bit more empathetic to that when we are still all benefiting from this globalized process of international trade.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Obviously, an island state feels it much more keenly. But, even as somebody living in a big city like London, we just blame the local supermarket when we don't have the pasta we want. But, in fact, there's a whole supply chain behind that we should be making ourselves aware of. Thank you so much, Ian. Great to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to Ian Ralby and John Attenborough, as well as my colleague Francesca, for their insights. You've been listening to Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you would never miss an episode. And if you'd like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.